Joining us now, as he does each and every week, to talk about the latest in the business and economic sector is Dr. Michael Greiner, an assistant professor of management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration. Dr. Greiner, thank you as always for joining us. Happy Friday.
Yes, happy Friday to you. It's great to be back.
Yeah, glad to have you on, as it's been another busy week in news in the business and economic sector. And perhaps the biggest news over the last 24 hours has been a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn affirmative action. That particularly going to affect college admissions, and especially college admissions for Black, Indigenous, people of color populations. So what ultimately does this decision affect, and how can we maybe see it have an immediate effect on admissions to colleges, not necessarily this coming fall, but the next class over?
Well, in Michigan, we're kind of in an interesting situation in that, as you may recall, back in, I think it was 2006, we passed a Proposal 2, which changed the Constitution to make it that Michigan colleges were unable to consider race as part of their admissions process anyway. So it's not like this is something that hasn't already been kind of factoring into Michigan colleges' decisions. And actually, one interesting thing about this is that the case that was originally brought, before the Supreme Court last time, is Grutter v. Bollinger. I'm sure many people remember that. That was actually a University of Michigan case. The University of Michigan was essentially told to change the process that they used for considering race, but we're still allowed to use it. That was back in 2003. Then, of course, the state ended up changing the rules, which made it so that the University of Michigan was no longer allowed to consider race at all, as were any of the other colleges in Michigan. And as it turns out, the University of Michigan has since struggled with trying to recruit as diverse a student body as they had previously. And in fact, they specifically had filed a friend of the court brief with the Supreme Court, essentially describing their experience since there was this change with essentially banning affirmative action from their admissions decisions. And what they showed is that they've really had to make a lot of effort to try to reach out to other communities. But even with doing so, there has been a drop in the percentage of students, particularly students of color, relative to their overall population in the Michigan student population. So we are actually kind of at the center of this whole debate here in Michigan. Now, the schools that are most affected, it appears, will be the more selective ones. And in Michigan, there actually will be some schools that are affected, and those are the schools that are private schools, because the constitutional amendment to the state constitution only affected public schools, so schools like U of M or Oakland University or Michigan State. But there are some pretty selective private schools here in Michigan, like, for example, Kalamazoo College, or right down the street from us, Rochester College. Either one of those schools now are not going to be able to consider race as part of their admissions decision. And from what I've read, it sounds like it's not going to have a huge impact on how they proceed, but certainly it could have an impact based upon what the University of Michigan has experienced in the percentage of the student body in other states that is made up of minority students.
And this is a decision that was made earlier on this week. The case in particular was Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated versus the President and Fellows of Harvard College. That is Supreme Court case 20-1199, in which it was then ruled in the affirmative that the admissions program, this is per the Supreme Court's website at supremecourt.gov, the admissions program at Harvard College and the University of North Carolina violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. That is what was being argued in the affirmative opinion by 6 of the Supreme Court's justices, with the rest of the board then voting against this particular bill. Also making news this week, Dr. Greiner, was Michigan's receiving over $1.5 billion to extend its broadband internet infrastructure. This is part of a over $240 billion plan from the Biden administration to expand high-speed internet access across the United States. So tell us about this program and how it might actually help to expand Michigan's high-speed internet infrastructure, especially in places that are maybe not necessarily having as great of access to that high-speed internet at this time.
Yeah, this was actually exciting news for everybody here in Michigan. Certainly for the administration, who have been making expanding internet access here in Michigan a priority. And it's really an economic development issue. I was trying to kind of think of an analogy here. And what I was thinking of is it's like when we first started getting electric across the country, when we first started getting phone service. Obviously, the urban areas, the areas that where a private entity is able to attach a lot of properties very quickly and make a profit essentially from charging them for that service, those areas are going to be the most quickly attached. The ones that tend to take longer to essentially get the benefits of the rest of the grid are those more rural areas. And indeed, we've seen that here in Michigan, where especially areas, say, in the upper part of the Lower Peninsula and in parts of the Upper Peninsula, they do not have broadband internet access, and that essentially makes that they're unable to participate in the economy as it is today. I mean, I see this all the time, and I'm sure that you see this as well. When I'm doing my research now, I don't even need to go to the library anymore. Everything is done online. The fact that I have broadband internet access is a huge, it's not just a convenience. I mean, it's time is money. You're able to take care of things so much more quickly and so much more efficiently and have access to so much more information than you would otherwise, as well as doing things like what we're doing right now, just having a meeting virtually over the internet. Things like that are not available to people in large parts of Michigan. And so this additional funding is going to essentially allow us to be able to bring those people into the grid and kind of enable them to join the 21st century as it is right now.
Yeah, it kind of all ties back to what's been an argument, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, but really over the last couple of decades, about how much internet access really is to be considered an essential utility, like you would have heat or air conditioning, water access, gas access, and the like. Internet access now being part of that discussion, and certainly why it's being focused on by the Biden administration at the federal level, as well as the Whitmer administration here in the state of Michigan. It's the difference between being able to, like you said, do your research, do your schoolwork online, apply for jobs, and especially paying your bills too. A lot of that also now online, with some companies even requiring online bill paying. Also making news this week, Dr. Greiner, on the automotive side, as Michigan continues to be on the forefront of that sort of transition we're seeing in automotive from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Ford has actually been cutting some jobs, or potentially may cut jobs in their transition to electric vehicles. That is really ticking off the UAW, especially as they come toward potentially going on strike. Tell us about that, how that may how this transition to electric vehicles is already affecting potential future jobs right here in Michigan.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a tough time right now, because you have to remember the current UAW president was only recently elected. The first time they've actually had direct election of officers at the UAW, after there was a scandal a few years back. And they essentially changed their processes to allow the individual members to be able to vote for the presidents. And this current president ended up essentially campaigning and saying that he wanted to be tougher on the automakers, essentially win back some of the concessions that the workers had made back in 2008, 2009 as a result of the financial crisis, and to help the automakers survive. But also we have the issue where there were the lower tiers of workers, where certain workers are paid less than other workers, and the current president wants to do away with that. And what's more is there's constantly been this process of essentially bidding out many of the things that once were done in-house by the automakers. It's been something that has really been noticeable. Certainly there are benefits to trade, and this is something that goes back to a bigger issue that we talk a lot about in our economics classes, which is the overall benefit that you get from trade. But the disruption that occurs in local communities as jobs essentially are shipped overseas that are more efficiently done elsewhere has been very disruptive. It's been very hard for these communities to recover, and certainly we've seen evidence of that, here in Michigan, where a lot of auto-related jobs have moved not just to other countries, but even to other parts of the country here in the United States. There are other parts of the country where they're able to pay lower wages, where you have lower union penetration. And as a result of that, the UAW now is kind of trying to push back on those trends and say, we want to take a more aggressive stance. We don't want to essentially let the, kind of give everything to the automakers. And we want to win back some of these concessions that we've made in the past. So the current president has actually sent a very strong message to the automakers that they should be prepared for potentially a strike when the contracts come up in September with the big three. So it's going to be interesting to see the way that develops. But this is all happening within the context of this shift to electric vehicles. And you've got a couple things going on with that shift. Number one, you've got the fact that there's kind of this whole, what comes first, the chicken or the egg syndrome. Are we going to have enough of the charging stations, or are there going to be charging stations then without vehicles to be able to charge? And so there's been this balancing act that both the automakers and the government has been kind of working, and we've talked about this before, to try to kind of bring both up at the same time. And the automakers, to their credit, have really invested quite a bit in developing their production of electric vehicles. Ford is one of the leading ones, and they right now are producing, I think, around 600,000 electric vehicles a year, and they're hoping in the next couple of years to get it up to 2 million. They think that they'll be profitable once they get up to that 2 million in about, I think, 2026. But up until now, they've been losing money hand over fist doing this to the tune of $3 billion. So essentially, you've got the automakers saying, "Look, we're losing money. We're trying to make this transition into the essentially the auto market of the future." The workers are concerned that they're not getting the benefit of the profits that have been coming into the internal combustion engine side of the business, and so you're going to see a lot of tension, I think, coming on between the UAW and the automakers in the next few months.
How much of this is connected to cost-cutting efforts by the big three in particular, which are where this UAW president really is expressing that potential for a strike? How much of this is connected to cost-cutting because of supply chain issues? We know that the Detroit News this week had mentioned that the House Committee on China was discussing or was lobbied by the auto execs in our local area that the supply chain is really affecting their ability to be competitive on a worldwide level and is costing them a lot of money. Those continued issues on the supply chain, getting internal combustion engines out. And certainly that's got to be playing a role in the creation of electric vehicles, with a lot of these microchips that are key parts of these electric vehicles still being produced in Taiwan and in China and other parts of the world. How is that playing a factor in the bottom line of these automakers, and maybe even the reasons why they're cutting some of these jobs?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge part of it, Tyler. And it just speaks to the fact that the whole world has been disrupted with this pandemic crisis that we had. As a result of that, we remember there were all these disruptions to the supply chains, and we still haven't entirely recovered from them. And this is kind of also, again, there's so many things going on at the same time that are leading to this crisis right now, where you've got the United States essentially standing up to China and saying, look, we're not enthusiastic about the fact that you've essentially been taking these aggressive trading stances with us in the past, and we want to essentially be on a more level playing field with China. China had the advantage in the past of the fact that it was a developing country. So I think that there were a lot of countries, the United States included, who were kind of giving it the benefit of the doubt and saying, look, we're going to essentially give it a wink and a nod with its trade practices and allow it to engage in some practices that, frankly, we would not allow in most other countries. Examples would include things like equal access to each other's markets. There's an example of where Chinese automakers for autonomous vehicles are actually testing their vehicles in the United States right now, whereas American automakers working on similar vehicles are not able to test their vehicles in China. Then there's the issue of the theft of intellectual property, which is widespread among Chinese firms. And American firms are constantly getting victimized by the fact that we're essentially developing these innovations that just then get essentially taken by the Chinese without any kind of compensation or anything. And we're seeing that, for example, with the electric vehicles, where right now, some of the largest manufacturers of electric vehicles are actually Chinese firms, and they're using technology in many cases that was developed here in the United States. And so there's kind of this sense that, we don't want to allow China to kind of walk all over us anymore. They've developed now to the point where they are the world's second largest economy. They're one of America's largest trading partners, and it's time that they essentially have to play by the same rules that everybody else does.
Dr. Michael Greiner from Oakland University School of Business Administration joins us on today's edition of the Megacast for our weekly business and economics segment. You can find all those segments dating back several months and several years on civiccentertv.com/Megacast. Dr. Greiner, on the inflation front, we're seeing some positive news and inflation dropping enough to where we're seeing now rental prices starting to go down in the state of Michigan, providing some relief to the average Michigander, particularly on the housing front in that regard. But also, we know that we're just a couple months away. In September, the student loan repayment pause is no longer, and those payments are going to come back into play for Michiganders all across the board. So how are these two factors kind of playing into those daily and those monthly costs that are affecting the cost of living here in Michigan?
Yeah, they are definitely playing in. You have to remember the way that inflation is calculated is essentially the federal government will look at a basket of goods. They call it a basket of goods and services that the average household is going to incur. Now, a big part of what's in that basket, of course, are housing costs, anywhere from 30 to 40% for most households. And those costs have been increasing quite dramatically, especially in rents. Now, you have to remember, just because you own your home and you're paying on your mortgage doesn't mean that isn't factored into the basket of goods that the federal government considers. In fact, what they'll do is that they will essentially take what you would be paying as rent and applying it to your costs and what they call owner's equivalent rent. So this is where sometimes we'll see these different measures of inflation showing different things. Because part of the problem we have when you're looking at housing is that housing prices tend to be set on a year-by-year basis. People tend to sign their leases for an entire year. So even though the costs have gone down quite a bit now, and we're seeing quite a bit of evidence of that for housing, that isn't entirely reflected in the inflation figures yet, because again, we're still looking at the leases in many cases that were signed a year ago or more in some cases. So, and then that has the impact then upon the people who own their homes. So when you're seeing the inflation, a lot of the inflation number is driven by this increase in the housing cost. So the fact that that's slowing down should have a dramatic impact on the inflationary numbers that we're seeing. At the same time, the other side that is that, of course, we know the Fed has been increasing interest rates. And basically, what the Fed's trying to do there is essentially take money out of the economy to slow down the economy and stop people from spending money as quickly as they have been, because that's what then drives up prices. Well, obviously, if people now are directing some of the funds that they would have been spending just on consumer goods or services to be paying back debt, particularly the student loan debt, something that they have been paying back now for about 3 years since the pandemic came on, then that's going to suddenly put a huge cut in the disposable income that many households have. I believe that about 40% of Michigan households have some type of student loan debt, with about 20% of them having a substantial amount. So that's going to essentially take money out of the economy. And in some respects, although it's going to certainly hurt the bottom line for many families, mine included, of course, who do have student loan debt, at the same time, it's going to help the Fed, because it's going to kind of take some of that money out of the economy and maybe reduce some of the pressure that they've been fighting, that's been constantly driving up inflation over the past year or so.
Yeah, unfortunately, greater costs month to month for the average person here in our state and across the union as a result of these repayments coming back into play. But perhaps with taking some of that, as you said, disposable income out of the economy could help on the inflation front, bring some of those other costs down. Dr. Greiner, thank you as always for joining us.
Great to be here. Have a great 4th of July.